The smell of old paper and lukewarm coffee has a way of grounding a person in the present, even when the soul is drifting years into the future. Most people believe that poverty is a lack of money and wealth is an abundance of it. But if you watch closely, you'll see that the true divide isn't found in a bank ledger. It is found in the way a man looks at a Tuesday afternoon. To some, time is a predator to be escaped. To others, it is a garden to be tended. If you find yourself drawn to these quiet observations of the decisions that shape our lives, this is the Rich versus Poor Journal. Subscribe and let us walk through these stories together. Arthur sat in the same ergonomic chair he had occupied for 8 years. The office was quiet, save for the hum of the HVAC system and the rhythmic clicking of keyboards, the heartbeat of corporate safety. Arthur liked safety. He liked the predictable pulse of a direct deposit every alternate Friday. It was a shield against the chaos of the world. Across town, in a workspace that smelled of sawdust and wet ink, Elias stood before a drafting table. Elias didn't have a shield. He had a lease he could barely afford and a specialized printing press that required a specific, expensive kind of maintenance. The two men had graduated from the same university, shared the same mentors, and once the same ambitions. But as the years pressed on, a subtle fracture began to form in how they viewed the concept of enough. For Arthur, enough was a ceiling. It was the point where the bills were paid, the retirement account was automated, and the anxiety stayed at a manageable simmer. He spent his evenings in a state of soft decompression, watching shadows move across the wall of his well-furnished apartment. He felt a sense of profound relief that he didn't have to worry. He had traded his volatility for a flat line. Elias, however, viewed enough as a floor, a cold, hard surface he was constantly trying to push off from. His evenings were not spent in decompression, but in a state of high-alert observation. He wasn't working harder than Arthur in the physical sense, but his mind was never off the clock. He was obsessed with the mechanics of value. He wondered why some things endured while others withered. He took his meager profits and, instead of buying the comfort Arthur enjoyed, he bought more efficient tools. He lived in a state of perpetual, controlled discomfort. 3 years passed without much fanfare. In Arthur's world, the increments of change were microscopic. A 3% raise, a slightly newer car. The furniture was a bit nicer, the coffee beans a bit more expensive. But the internal landscape was stagnant. He began to notice a peculiar weight in his chest during the Sunday evening hours. It wasn't sadness. It was a realization that his life had become a closed loop. He was safe, yes, but he was also finished. He had reached the summit of his own expectations, and the view was remarkably ordinary. Elias's 3 years had been a series of small, quiet collapses. A contract lost, a machine broken, a month where he ate nothing but lentils and toast. To an outside observer, Elias was failing. He looked tired. His clothes were older than Arthur's, but if you looked at his hands, they were steady. He had developed a relationship with risk that Arthur couldn't conceive of. Elias no longer feared the what-if because he had lived through the what-if and survived. He had stopped seeing money as a way to buy things and started seeing it as a way to buy back his agency. Every dollar he didn't spend on a luxury was a brick in a fortress of his own making. Another 5 years drifted by, moving with the silent weight of an incoming tide. Arthur was now a senior manager. His office had a window. He sat in meetings and discussed mitigating variables and long-term stability. But the shield he had built was beginning to feel like a cage. The world outside was changing. Technology was shifting the bedrock of his industry. For the first time, the safety he had worshipped felt fragile. He realized that because he had never practiced being uncomfortable, he no longer knew how to handle a storm. He had optimized for a world that was slowly disappearing. One afternoon, Arthur took a walk through the old district and found himself standing outside a renovated warehouse. The sign above the door was elegant, understated. Through the glass, he saw Elias. Elias wasn't at a drafting table anymore. He was walking through a floor of busy artisans, his movements slow and deliberate. He wasn't rushing. He didn't look like a man who was grinding for a result. He looked like a man who owned the air he breathed. The printing business had evolved into a design firm, then a consultancy, then something larger, an ecosystem of value that Elias had nurtured from the sawdust up. He didn't have the frantic energy of the successful. He had the stillness of someone who knew that even if the building burned down tomorrow, he possessed the internal machinery to build it again. Arthur watched from the sidewalk. He felt a strange, hollow sensation. He realized that while he had been saving money, Elias had been building capacity. Arthur had been protecting his present, while Elias had been investing in his future self. The difference was no longer subtle. It was an ocean. The sun began to set, casting long amber shadows across the pavement. Arthur walked back to his car, the leather seats cool and inviting. He thought about his bank account, which was quite full. Then he thought about his time, which was entirely spoken for. He was a man who had everything he had ever asked for, only to realize he had asked for the wrong things. He had sought the absence of pain rather than the presence of purpose. Back in the warehouse, Elias turned off the lights in his office. He didn't feel like a winner. He just felt prepared. The struggle hadn't been a means to an end. It had been the forge. He knew that wealth wasn't the number in the ledger. It was the lack of a ceiling. It was the ability to look at a Tuesday afternoon and decide exactly what it was worth. The two men lived in the same city, breathed the same air, and used the same currency. But they lived in different universes. One lived in a world of preservation, where every day was a defense against loss. The other lived in a world of expansion, where every day was an invitation to build. As the city lights began to flicker on, the silence settled between them, a vast, unbridgeable gap made of 1,000 tiny choices. We often think we are choosing between being rich or being poor. In reality, we are choosing between the comfort of a known cage and the terrifying beauty of an open field. And the most haunting part is that by the time we realize which one we've chosen, the gate is often already locked. Time does not care about our intentions. It only honors our investments. If this story resonated with you, perhaps you'll find value in our other narratives on the psychology of wealth and the quiet moments that define us.